The Atlantic lay in a gray stillness that morning, a wide and patient expanse that seemed indifferent to the war already chewing at its edges. And in that quiet, a small message drifted through Allied channels with the weight of something not yet understood. It was not dramatic, not even urgent, just a fragment of coded information rooted through a network that was already drowning in paper and radio chatter. But it carried within it the outline of a coming disaster. Somewhere between the low hum of wireless rooms and the cluttered desks of intelligence offices, the signal lost its sharpness, smoothed down by assumptions and habit until it became just another line in a daily stream of reports across the ocean. Convoys moved, as they always had, long lines of merchant ships creeping westward under low clouds, their decks slick with spray and their crews hardened by months of monotony and fear. Men leaned against cold railings, smoking and watching the horizon, their senses tuned for the periscope wake or the sudden shadow beneath the waves. Yet nothing in their routine hinted that the sea itself had shifted against them. Engines throbbed. In steady rhythms below, cargo holds were packed with fuel, food, and ammunition, and the war felt distant in those early hours, reduced to a dull awareness rather than an immediate threat in distant headquarters. Analysts pored over maps and intercepted transmissions, trying to impose order on a chaos of movements that stretched from Norway to the Caribbean. The missed signal lay among these documents, buried under layers of interpretation and competing priorities, its significance diluted by the sheer volume of information passing through tired hands. No one ignored it deliberately, and no one dismissed it with malice, but the machinery of war had a way of grinding down subtle warnings until they became indistinguishable from routine noise. It was a flaw born of scale, not of intent, and it would prove just as lethal. Out on the water, the weather closed in, bringing low visibility and a rolling swell that made even seasoned sailors feel small. Lookouts strained their eyes through binoculars streaked with salt, scanning a horizon that seemed to offer nothing but shifting gray. Below them, steel hulls cut through the Atlantic, unaware that unseen hunters were already adjusting their positions, guided by information that had slipped past Allied awareness. The sea carried sound and motion in strange ways, and far beneath the waves, it was alive with quiet calculations. Inside, one convoy escort, a young officer traced routes on a chart table, pencil marks smudged by damp air and constant handling. He trusted the patterns laid out by higher command, the arcs of protection that were supposed to keep merchantmen safe, and he had no reason to doubt them. The war at sea was already a game of incomplete knowledge, and every decision rested on what could be seen, heard, or inferred. That missed signal, though, represented something that had been known but not recognized, a difference that would soon matter more than anyone could imagine. The Atlantic had always been a place of both connection and isolation, and now it was becoming a battlefield shaped by information as much as by steel. Radios crackled with routine updates, weather reports, and position checks, each message reinforcing a sense of controlled movement across a hostile environment. Yet beneath that order, the ocean hid its own truths, and the subtle shift caused by the overlooked warning was already bending the balance. It was not yet visible in smoke or fire, only in the invisible geometry of risk that surrounded every ship. As the day wore on, the convoys pressed forward, their wakes trailing like thin scars across the water. Sailors went about their duties, stowing gear, checking lines, and sharing brief jokes that kept fear at bay. None of them knew that the margin of safety they relied on had quietly narrowed, that somewhere in the chain of command a small piece of clarity had slipped through. The war, from their perspective, remained what it had always been, a distant menace punctuated by long stretches of waiting. The Atlantic held its breath as unseen forces as the days passed. The faint disturbance created by that overlooked signal began to express itself in small, troubling ways across the Atlantic. Reports of isolated sinkings arrived with a dull regularity, each one explained away as the unavoidable cost of a global war fought over vast distances. Clerks logged them, officers compared notes, and planners adjusted timetables. Yet the deeper pattern remained just beyond the edge of recognition. The sea had a way of disguising cause and effect, turning tragedy into a series of disconnected events that could be managed on paper even as lives were being erased in cold water. In convoy briefing rooms, the mood stayed outwardly professional, though a quiet tension threaded through every update. Escort commanders were told to maintain their routes and coverage, reassured that losses, while painful, did not yet point to a systemic failure. They trusted the intelligence that guided them, not knowing how much of it was already out of date. The Atlantic campaign depended on a constant exchange of information, and when even a small part of that exchange faltered, the effects multiplied, far faster than anyone could track. U-boat commanders, by contrast, were beginning to sense opportunity. Their radio intercepts and reconnaissance hinted at predictable movements, at gaps in Allied awareness that could be exploited with patience and precision. Submarines slid into favorable positions, engines idling as hydrophones listened for the low thrum of merchant propellers. To the men below the surface, the ocean felt suddenly generous, offering targets with a frequency that suggested the enemy had not yet realized how exposed he was. On the merchant ships themselves, sailors felt a creeping unease that had little to do with any single event. They heard of sinkings through fragments of radio chatter and whispered conversations, and every rumor seemed to confirm that the Atlantic was growing more dangerous. Watches were doubled, lifeboats checked again and again, and the simple act of standing on deck at night took on a heavier weight. Even without clear explanations, the men sensed that something had shifted in Allied intelligence centers. Analysts struggled to keep pace with the rising tide of information. New reports arrived faster than old ones could be fully digested, and the missed signal remained buried in that flood, its importance diluted by the noise of 1,000 other data points. There was no dramatic failure, only a slow accumulation of small misjudgments that allowed the enemy to move with increasing confidence. Each decision made in good faith now rested on an incomplete picture. The weather turned harsher as winter pressed in, complicating an already strained situation. Storms scattered convoys and forced escorts to break formation, creating momentary gaps that the boats were quick to exploit. Radar and sonar, still imperfect tools, struggled against rough seas and electrical interference, and crews learned to mistrust what their instruments told them. In those moments of uncertainty, the absence of accurate intelligence became a tangible vulnerability. Survivors from torpedoed ships began to arrive in ports on both sides of the Atlantic, carrying stories that were at once personal and disturbingly consistent. They spoke of attacks that came without warning, of submarines that seemed to know exactly where to strike. Their words filtered into official reports, but it took time for human experience to translate into strategic insight. By then, the pattern had already taken deeper root. The war at sea was always a contest of adaptation, and for now the advantage lay with those who had recognized the opening created by Allied blindness. Convoys still sailed, cargo still moved, and the machinery of logistics continued to grind forward. But the balance that kept it all functioning was beginning to tilt. What had been a manageable risk was becoming something far more costly, even if the full scope of that change was not yet understood. The ocean, indifferent to flags and ideologies, simply carried the consequences forward, wave by wave, until every small error became a physical reality. Steel, flesh, and fuel met in violent convergence, and the Atlantic recorded it all in silence, holding the evidence long after the radios fell quiet and long after the war would try to forget what it had allowed. By the time the pattern could no longer be ignored, the Atlantic had already become a field of wreckage and grief, its surface broken by oil slicks and drifting debris that told a story no report could soften. Convoys that once crossed with only nervous caution now moved with a sense of hunted urgency, every mile feeling heavier than the last. Merchant crews watched the water with exhausted eyes, aware that survival depended on forces far beyond their control, and every unexplained noise carried the weight of a possible attack. Patrols pressed their advantage with disciplined efficiency. Their commanders, guided by intercepted traffic and a growing understanding of Allied routes, positioned their boats like chess pieces beneath the waves. Torpedoes were no longer fired at random targets of opportunity, but at carefully selected ships, whose loss would echo through supply lines. Each successful strike reinforced the sense that the enemy's blindness was still intact, and that the window opened by the missed signal had not yet closed. Inside Allied operations rooms, tension thickened as casualty lists grew. Charts that once showed confident arcs of protection were now pocked with red marks, indicating sinkings, and the human cost behind those symbols was impossible to ignore. Planners began to question their assumptions, comparing survivor accounts with intelligence summaries in search of coherence. The realization crept in that they were not merely losing ships, but losing understanding, and in a war fought across invisible distances. That loss was as dangerous as any torpedo at sea. The escorts did what they could, weaving back and forth around vulnerable merchantmen, dropping depth charges into the dark with more hope than certainty. Sonar pings echoed through cold water, sometimes finding only empty space, sometimes missing a threat that slipped away just beyond reach. Crews worked until their hands were raw and their nerves frayed, driven by the knowledge that every failure would be paid for by men they might never meet. The psychological strain was relentless. Sailors learned to live with the idea that death could arrive without warning, a violent eruption from a calm surface. Sleep came in short, uneasy bursts, and even moments of safety were haunted by memory and anticipation. The Atlantic was no longer just a route between continents, but a shifting maze where unseen enemies dictated the terms of survival. Gradually, a clearer picture began to emerge from the chaos. Analysts noticed correlations that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, and a handful of officers revisited older reports, including the one that had first hinted at the enemy's evolving tactics. What had once seemed like a minor anomaly now aligned with too many recent events to be ignored. The missed signal started to take shape as a warning that had arrived before the system was ready to interpret it. This growing awareness did not bring immediate relief. The enemy still held the advantage, and every convoy that sailed did so under a shadow that could not yet be lifted. But something had changed within Allied command, a shift from complacent routine to uneasy vigilance. The war at sea was being re-examined, not just as a matter of ships and weapons, but as a contest of information and perception. The Atlantic continued to claim its toll, but within the noise and loss, the groundwork for a more effective response was being laid. Each new report, each fragment of survivor testimony, added another layer to a picture that was finally coming into focus. The cost of delay remained written in steel and blood, yet the slow convergence of understanding hinted that the balance might not stay tilted forever. As the scattered pieces of information began to align, Allied commanders found themselves confronting the uncomfortable truth that the war they thought they were fighting was not the war actually unfolding across the Atlantic. The missed signal, once an obscure technical detail, now stood at the center of a widening circle of evidence. It pointed to an enemy that had anticipated Allied movements with unnerving accuracy, and to a defensive system that had been operating on assumptions no longer valid. This recognition carried no drama, only a heavy clarity that arrived too late for many of the ships already resting on the ocean floor. Operations rooms grew quieter as officers absorbed the implications. Maps were redrawn, convoy schedules scrutinized, and intelligence officers pushed to reconcile their earlier confidence with the grim reality before them. There was a sense of collective responsibility, not in the legal sense, but in a deeper, moral one, as if everyone present understood that the system they served had failed men who would never return. That awareness did not paralyze them, but it stripped away any lingering illusions of control. At sea, the pressure on escort crews intensified even as their orders began to change. New routes were proposed, patrol zones adjusted, and additional resources slowly directed toward the most threatened corridors. Sailors felt the difference in subtle ways, in altered headings and more frequent course corrections. Yet the ocean remained just as unforgiving. Every adjustment was made under fire, in a battle space that did not pause to allow for strategic reflection. The technical side of the war also shifted. Analysts demanded better integration between intercepted enemy communications, reconnaissance, and convoy tracking, trying to ensure that no future warning would be lost in bureaucratic fog. Equipment that had once been considered secondary gained new importance, and training emphasized the interpretation of faint or ambiguous signals. The missed message had revealed a vulnerability not in hardware but in human systems, and correcting that required more than new machines. For those still sailing the Atlantic, these changes offered only cautious reassurance. They sought escorts arriving sooner, heard radio traffic grow denser, and noticed a more coordinated presence around their ships. Yet they also carried the memory of friends and crewmates who had been taken before this awakening occurred. The ocean did not erase those losses simply because strategy had improved. U-boat commanders, meanwhile, began to sense that the environment was becoming less favorable. Their attacks met with quicker, more focused responses, and the easy successes of earlier months gave way to a more contested hunt. Depth charges fell closer, patrol aircraft appeared more frequently, and the Atlantic no longer felt quite as open. The window created by Allied blindness was narrowing, though its full closure was still some distance away. The war at sea was entering a new phase, shaped by the painful lessons of the previous one. The missed signal, once a forgotten line in a report, had become a catalyst for change, forcing a re-evaluation of how information was gathered, shared, and trusted. That shift did not undo the past, but it began to impose a new discipline on the present. In this evolving balance, the Atlantic remained a place of risk and sacrifice, yet also of adaptation. Ships continued to cross, crews continued to watch the horizon, and the invisible struggle of data and interpretation now carried as much weight as any gun or torpedo. The price of delay could never be repaid, but the determination to learn from it was shaping a more resilient defense, one that sought to ensure no warning would ever again pass so quietly into obscurity. With the gradual tightening of Allied coordination, the Atlantic began to feel less like an open hunting ground, more like a contested frontier. Convoys moved under thicker layers of protection, their escorts linked by a denser web of communication that left fewer blind spots for the enemy to exploit. The sea was still vast and indifferent, but the patterns of movement within it were becoming more deliberate, shaped by an awareness that had been bought at tremendous cost. On the decks of merchant ships, sailors noticed the difference in small but meaningful ways. Patrol aircraft appeared overhead with reassuring regularity, and radio messages carried clearer, more consistent instructions. Even so, the strain of earlier losses lingered, etched into faces that had seen too many empty bunks and too many silent roll calls. The Atlantic was safer than it had been, but it was not yet forgiving. Escort crews adapted quickly to their new role in a more integrated defense. Sonar operators refined their listening techniques, distinguishing between the harmless echoes of the sea and the subtle signatures of steel holes below. Gunners kept constant watch, scanning for the faintest sign of a periscope or a breaking wake. Their work was exhausting, a relentless cycle of alertness that left little room for rest. Yet it carried a renewed sense of purpose. In headquarters, the flow of intelligence was now treated with a level of scrutiny that had been missing before. Signals were cross-checked, anomalies flagged, and the kind of quiet warning that had once slipped through unnoticed was now given the attention it deserved. This was not a perfect system, but it was one shaped by the hard understanding that, in a war of information, even a whisper could matter. U-boat crews felt the pressure as their operating environment grew more hostile. Where once they had slipped into position with relative ease, they now found themselves tracked, harried, and forced to maneuver defensively. The ocean still offered concealment, but it no longer guaranteed surprise. Each patrol became a test, of endurance as much as of skill, and the balance of fear slowly began to shift. The human dimension of the campaign remained stark. Survivors of earlier sinkings were still being reunited with families, carrying memories that would never fade, while new crews took their places aboard ships that would sail into the same dangerous waters. The difference now was that those voyagers were guided by a deeper awareness of what had gone wrong, and a determination not to repeat it. Through this period of adjustment, the Atlantic War regained a measure of equilibrium. Losses did not cease, and the sea continued to claim lives, but the scale and predictability of those losses changed. The enemy no longer dictated the tempo with the same confidence, and Allied forces began to feel that their efforts were finally aligned with reality. The missed signal, though still a painful reminder of earlier failure, had indirectly forced a reckoning that strengthened the entire system. It had revealed the fragility of assumptions and the necessity of constant vigilance. Lessons that extended far beyond any single report or decision. In the slow, grinding rhythm of the Atlantic campaign, those lessons were now being written into every escort, every patrol, and every line of communication, shaping a more resilient struggle against an ocean and an enemy that had shown no mercy. By the time the Atlantic campaign reached this steadier phase, the meaning of that single missed signal had grown far beyond its original technical context. It had become a quiet emblem of how modern war could hinge on the smallest fragments of information, and of how human systems, no matter how vast or well-intentioned, could falter in ways that cost thousands of lives. The ocean still held the wrecks of those ships, their steel frames slowly dissolving in the cold depths. Silent witnesses to decisions made far away. For the men who survived the worst months, the war at sea left an imprint that no victory could erase. They remembered the sound of rushing water in a torn hull, the shock of cold that stole breath and strength, and the sight of comrades disappearing beneath the waves. These experiences were not abstract statistics, but lived realities that followed them long after they left the deck of a ship. The improvements in strategy and coordination that came later offered little comfort to those who had already paid the price. Yet within the machinery of the Allied effort, the lessons of failure were not forgotten. Procedures were rewritten, communication channels refined, and a culture of skepticism toward easy assumptions took root. Analysts learned to listen more carefully for the quiet anomalies that might signal a deeper truth, and commanders grew more willing to challenge inherited patterns when the evidence demanded it. The missed warning had taught them that certainty was a luxury the Atlantic would not allow. The enemy, too, adapted to this new reality, finding their earlier freedom of movement increasingly constrained. The ocean remained dangerous, but it was no longer tilted so sharply in their favor. Each patrol became a calculated risk rather than an assured opportunity, and the relentless pressure of Allied escorts slowly wore down the effectiveness of the submarine campaign. What had once felt like an invisible advantage was now contested at every turn. In the wider sweep of the war, the Atlantic stabilization played a crucial role in sustaining the Allied advance. Supplies reached their destinations with greater reliability, enabling operations on distant fronts that would have been impossible under the earlier conditions of chaos. The sea, still vast and indifferent, had become a more dependable bridge rather than a corridor of unchecked loss. Looking back, The story of the missed signal is less about a single mistake than about the fragile nature of human perception in a world of overwhelming complexity. War compresses time, multiplies decisions, and demands that people see clearly through layers of uncertainty. When that clarity fails, even briefly, consequences ripple outward in ways that no one can fully control. The Atlantic Campaign ultimately moved forward on the strength of hard-earned awareness, built from the wreckage of earlier Those who perished in the wake of that initial oversight did not see the correction that followed, but their loss shaped a more resilient effort that carried the war toward its conclusion. In the endless motion of the sea, their story endures, a reminder that in the machinery of conflict, every signal matters, and every silence carries weight.